This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Regional Host Chair Allen Institute this June in Seattle for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Hello, I'm Steve Usdin, Washington editor of BioCentury. Today, I'm joined by Karen Knudsen, CEO of the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy, former leader of the American Cancer Society, and a PhD scientist. The idea that activating the body's immune system could fight cancer was a fringe idea for 100 years until the 1990s, and it remained on the margins of medicine until about 25 years ago. Now, almost everyone my age knows someone who's benefited from advances in cancer therapy based on immunotherapies, even if they aren't aware of the science behind the remissions and in some cases cures. But we all also know someone who has suffered, someone who has died from cancer despite the advances. So it's personal for everyone. Most people also don't understand that the rate-limiting factor in cancer drug development isn't so much the pace of scientific discovery. That's astounding. It's turning discoveries into therapies and then iterating for continuous improvement. These two insights, the central role of immunology in creating better cancer therapies and the need to improve the translation of science into medicine, drive the Parker Institute. And that's why I'm really looking forward to this discussion today with Karen. So I want to start. The traditional model, a simplified version of it anyway, the government and philanthropies fund basic science, venture capitalists and biopharma companies scour the literature, pick the ripe fruit, turn it into medicines. What's wrong with that? Why isn't it getting the job done?
So if that worked as described, that would be fantastic. But there's this sometimes forgotten about middle of what happens. How does a good discovery actually leave the laboratory floor and make it to the point where it can be commercialized through biopharma? In the middle, there has to be testing and translation of a good idea into truly preclinical work to say, if this is a new cancer therapeutic, in what cancers is it going to be most effective? What would have to be true in order for this to work? So preclinical studies that sometimes can't be funded by government or can't be funded by academic medicine because the resources are high. But then bringing it also through into clinical testing and actually sponsoring or resourcing a clinical trial to afford patients the best access to care, to cutting edge care, and also to learn from every patient about how to refine that new therapeutic so that it can go to the patients that would benefit most. So who owns that translational middle, let's call it? There are not enough of us in that space. The Parker Institute certainly is in that space. There are some mechanisms, not enough, in my opinion, from the US government of how to fund clinical trials into that space. And as a result, not enough therapies actually move quickly from concept to clinic or from clinic to commercialization. And so I really strongly believe, which is why I came to lead the Parker Institute, that we need to do much more to get the science out of the lab floor and into patient benefit.
So one of the things about the biopharma industry that I've noticed over the years, it kind of reminds me of third graders playing soccer, right? Everyone crowds around the ball, and there's coaches on the sidelines who are shouting, spread out, but they don't, So, like Keytruda and Opdivo, they were breakthroughs. But does the world really need 100 more of them just like that? Probably not. And so one of the things I think that's interesting about the Parker Institute is that you've got a vantage point to see the opportunities and the gaps and to go to where the ball isn't, but where it should be, right? So,
well, that's true.
What are you seeing now? What are the underappreciated scientific opportunities? Where is the ball going? Where should it be going?
Now you're talking about what I wake up every day thinking about, which is good. So, from our perspective, the way our model, just in brief, the way our model works is we are really truly meant to be end to end. So in the US for oncology, the typical time frame for a discovery to actually make it to FDA approval is between 12 and 15 years. So we measure our success by having an entirely self-enclosed ecosystem where we can reduce that time frame. That's our goal. And so, to your point, Steve, we think through what is the science that is the most game changing that could move forward. So, what are the kinds of things that we're really thinking about? So, we've just released our new scientific priorities, and one of them that I'll bring up as a potential game changer are therapeutic vaccines. So, for people who are watching or listening, you probably already know that there are actually quite good cancer vaccines that exist and have existed for years that are for cancer prevention, and they are incredibly effective. The call
For
out
cervical
there,
cancer in particular. Yeah. Yeah.
well, not just cervical cancer. So, there are 6 different cancers caused by the human papillomavirus. And I don't know one parent, being one of them, I don't know one parent alive who would not want to have their children avoid getting a cancer as an adult through a 2-shot inoculation. And that's what the HPV vaccine affords. We are now seeing this play out in real life, not just in the US, but globally, where there has been uptake of vaccination for boys and girls against HPV, that those women who were vaccinated as girls are now seeing a significant reduction in the incidence of cervical cancer. And of course, then a reduction in death from cervical cancer. This actually is a cancer we can eliminate through vaccination. But we are also now, as that first vaccine population is aging, we are now seeing both men and women vaccinated as children avoid head and neck cancer, for example, about 50% of which are caused by the human papillomavirus. So that's just an example of not a therapeutic, but a prevention vaccine that is incredibly effective. Now, fast forward into 2026, cancer vaccines are not just a fantasy anymore or a provocative idea. I'm talking about therapeutic vaccines, but I think are poised to become a core pillar of cancer therapies. And the time is right from the science perspective. We know much more about how a cancer cell looks different than self and how to direct a vaccine against that cell, because we know much more about how it's perceived by your immune system.
So,
We're
so
also able to leverage the mRNA vaccine technology that we learned during COVID. So we're seeing these early clinical signals of incredible wins with cancer therapeutic vaccines. Sorry, Steve, I didn't mean to
yeah,
interrupt you.
no, that's okay. No, I was interrupting you. So I was just saying, because I was actually at an event recently with Richard Pazder, who until recently was the head of the Oncology Center of Excellence at FDA. And I asked him kind of like, what's your vision for the future, 5 years, 10 years from now? And what he said was, somebody will get some kind of an early scan, ctDNA or something like that. They'll find out that they have a cancer. There'll be some kind of treatment for that cancer, targeted treatment, and then they'll get a vaccine that will prevent recurrence, because just treating the cancer initially, isn't going to be enough. Is that what you're talking about? And if it is, what do we need to do to speed it up to get to get to there quicker?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that what he just described, so much of that is going to come or is happening now. So just to kind of bring it from, to a high level, when you're treating someone who has an active cancer and you're treating them with chemotherapy, or you're treating them with traditional chemotherapy, or treating them with radiation therapy, they're being treated just during the time that they have the infusion or during the time that they're actually under the radiation beam. But when you train your immune system to detect and kill that cancer, that's a lifetime. And that's a lifetime of protection. So that's the purpose of a therapeutic vaccine. So a study that I'll call out that gives us, incredible confidence in the path forward. And there have been big advances in the pancreatic space, but I'll talk about an example in the renal cell space that played out with leaders from Dana-Farber. Catherine Wu is one of our major investigators at the Parker Institute, and her technology went into this. She's one of the world leaders in cancer therapeutic vaccines. And these are patients with renal cancer who had every expectation to have a recurrence after traditional cancer therapy. But those that were enrolled in the study, all of them, small numbers, but all of them were able to benefit from having a cancer therapeutic vaccine to prevent recurrence. And so all 9 patients over a long-term follow-up from this study, was conducted by Tony Schwery at Dana-Farber, who's just a brilliant mind, avoided a recurrence. So that's the incredible dramatic stride that we're looking for. So imagine a world like this, where we actually are able to interrogate cancer cells and understand what most difficult to treat cancers look like on the outside. What are the proteins decorating their surface? So if we knew that for pancreatic cancer, ovarian cancer, and I'm calling out the ones you actually can't screen for, right? What does it look like if we know someone's got these cancers, they undergo cancer therapy, but we're able to then treat them with a vaccine that prevents recurrence, which is in general, unfortunately what drives mortality from cancer. What does that look like? And so then once we've been able to identify that, how do we move it into earlier disease course so that we're not waiting for someone to have standard of care? It starts to become standard of care. Those realities, I think, will come in the next several years. But let's take it even further. What does it look like if I find out tomorrow that I'm a BRCA carrier? And so I'm at risk for a multitude of cancers throughout the entirety of my lifetime. What does a world look like if through advances in technology, we understand common features that, again, decorate the surface of BRCA-related cancers or hallmarks of BRCA-related cancers so that I can actually have a prevention vaccine, something that will actually prevent me from getting a cancer because I'm a BRCA carrier? Those sounded like fantasies 10 years ago. I think we're actually moving to the point where those are reality. So there's just one major area that we're very excited about.
And are we organized? Is the scientific community, the medical community, the biotech community organized to be able to advance that at the speed that you think could happen? I mean, I think that the like I said at the beginning, the rate limiting factor doesn't seem to be the scientific discovery, but the iteration, the even the regulatory system to have endpoints that can measure prevention, things like that. That doesn't all seem to be organized to me to be aligned to actually make that happen as quickly as it could.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. In short answer, the answer is no. Are we set up optimally for how discovery is done now and what the opportunities are? Absolutely not. I feel like, and I think I have good company in this feeling that we don't have a discovery problem here in the US or even globally. What we actually have is a translation problem and an inability to hand off from discovery into clinical testing. The ideas are there. The question is how we get those resourced to the point where, frankly, patients can benefit as quickly as humanly possible. Traditionally in that uncomfortable middle that people don't pay enough attention to, there are organizations like ours, which I mentioned. The government does, have some opportunities to pay for phase 1 testing. But who used to live in that middle as well was the venture capital world that would invest in early stage, potentially game-changing ideas to get them to the point where they could get into clinical testing and assess really whether or not this is a game-changing concept. And then start thinking through post that positive event, handoff for commercialization or an IPO. Right now, that's really not happening at the scale that we need it to. Too much capital is locked up in companies that haven't IPO'd or haven't been acquired. And so it feels like dwindling too few of us in this translational middle. How we solve for that really is a resource problem. So thinking differently about how to ensure that if you ran the government like a business and you invested all of this in discovery, where, at what point do you start to increase your investment in translation and into handoff for clinical testing? That's the proof point, right? The science by itself is not impactful. You can't have, if there's no access to an innovation, then what's the impact? So I do think that resourcing is one problem. You mentioned regulatory. I think it's very difficult for regulatory to keep up as well with what are the new endpoints that we need to think about. Prevention has been traditionally very hard to do because the time frames are very long. So how do we think about other endpoints that we might use to look for something that's prevention based? But there's just so much more that we need to do to keep up with the pace of innovation on both the resourcing and the regulatory side.
And we're going to take a break and we're going to come back. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the two things that every single one discussion seems to involve now around drug development. One is China and the other is AI. We'll be right back.
This episode of the BioCentury Show is brought to you by the third BioCentury Grand Rounds in Seattle. Advancing drug development requires more than discovery. It requires the right partners. The third edition of BioCentury Grand Rounds US convenes venture capital, biopharma decision makers, and academic innovators in Seattle, June 3rd to 5th. This R&D-focused forum brings together leaders at the forefront of translational science to examine the breakthroughs, bottlenecks, and strategies shaping the future of drug and diagnostic development, and how to make early-stage R&D investable. Discover cutting-edge disease biology and platform technologies. Gain insights from emerging biotechs and academic pioneers. Schedule partnering meetings with VCs, pharma, and leading academics who can accelerate your path forward. Grand Rounds US is where rigorous science meets strategic capital, and where the right conversations move discovery toward development. Join us in Seattle and discover what's next in biopharma and who's driving it. Secure your spot. Register at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
I'm back with Karen Knudsen, CEO of the Parker Institute. So Karen, we were talking, and I said, right before the break, China and AI. So you're talking about the difficulty of investing in this middle space. One thing that could be viewed as a positive, it's interesting because in Washington, everything's looked at as a zero-sum game. And when people talk about China, they think China's success is our defeat, or something like that. But when you're looking at biology, when you're looking at medicine, I'm not sure that's the case. So one of the things that I'm hearing from venture capitalists, from biotech companies around the world, is that they are going to China to do first-in-human studies, to lower the cost of discovery, but also of translation. Where do you see that? How do you think about China and this global ecosystem for developing therapies for cancer?
Yeah, I think your question, is also rooted in why I do, or my answer to your question is rooted in why I do what I do. Yes, I'm a scientist, always been a translational scientist. I was in healthcare for a long time, running oncology for a large health system across 2 states of people who had access to everything and people who truly had nothing, running oncology in the Safety Net Hospital of downtown Philadelphia. The reason that I do what I do, no matter what role I'm in, is because I do believe that science can improve health and that increased access should be something that is an ideal that we all hold to improve health across the globe. So I view the rise of China in inserting more investment into solving for the cancer problem and coming up with more concepts to solve for the cancer problem, including but not limited to drug development and investing in clinical trial infrastructure, which is good for people who live in China. I think this is a win. I think it's a win for cancer patients across the globe. So I welcome this. I think the solutions for cancer won't just be rooted in the U.S. The question is, how do we work together to make sure that we're leveraging information to solve for the cancer problem, learning from every patient as much as we possibly can, but then also ensuring that if the U.S. is not able to increase their investment in cancer science and in cancer translation, then maybe if China can pick up some of that slack, then I think we have to welcome that if what we're really in this for cancer patients.
Well, it's not like there aren't enough diseases to go around or enough problems in cancer to go around, right? It's not a zero-sum game. But in what you said there is interesting because it's really predicated on the idea of having this information exchange, having this exchange of scientific information, of clinical trial results and things like that. So you can have a system that's learning and moving forward globally.
I think you can. And some of our portfolio companies are doing their phase one studies in China. I think that's a win. If you're looking at the landscape from biopharma, there's a wide diversity of, those that have truly invested kind of in their R&D pipeline itself, and others that are kind of keeping a steady state in their R&D but are doing acquisitions from China. I feel like we hear one almost every week. And there's some really good things that are coming out of that. So I welcome that. I think the good ideas can come from anywhere. Full disclosure, right? I am on the board of a biopharma company that's very much global, but this is the view I'm giving you is one that's from Karen Knudsen, the head of the Parker Institute. That I really welcome the concept of being able to get our ideas that have come through our science and our portfolio companies into that phase of clinical assessment wherever the right patient lives and wherever we can do it with scale and speed.
So one of the things that I think about, and I think I mentioned this to you when we spoke some time ago, is it if you look at it, science also in the United States and around the world, maybe it isn't organized really to come up with effective therapies or functional cures for diseases so much. It's all kind of disaggregated, right? And I think of the success models, I think of cystic fibrosis, where you had one foundation, really one person, Bob Bell, who drove. He said, well, look, here's where we want to get. Here's where we are now. And let's just identify all the barriers and knock them down until we get something. And I'm wondering, is that the kind of model that we could use, not for cancer writ large, because there is no such thing, but for individual cancers, for lung cancer, for ovarian cancer, or something like that? Or does that not make any sense?
No, I mean, I think, look, I'm for whatever model works. But what I worry about in that scenario is you're right. Cancer it's not cystic fibrosis. It's 200 different diseases, all arising for a different reason and needing to be treated in a different way. So in the tissue type model, what I worry about is that that's maybe less relevant in the modern era than it is from a molecular assessment of the cancer. There's so much more that's in common between triple negative breast cancer and ovarian cancer than there is between triple negative breast cancer and ER positive breast cancer. So it's less about tissue of origin and more about what are the molecular drivers. I think that's the way I think about cancer. So unless you're organized that way, it could be kind of difficult. But what I do think works, again, just thinking about how we shape the scientific discovery and translation enterprise, which should lead to health in the US. If you think about it like running like a business, we have these incredible discoveries. We want to get them into clinical testing as soon as humanly possible. Without having an organized, aggregated plan for this, we've actually made great strides. So we've reduced cancer mortality in the US in total for these 200 different diseases. Cancer mortality has been reduced by 34% since 1991. So without a strategy, we've done it pretty well. So what does it look like if we actually put a strategy behind it? So anybody running a business would tell you that if you had 200 different priorities, you don't have any priorities, right? So then what does the health strategy look like for the US? Or what does the cancer strategy look like for the US? What's the low-hanging fruit? Of course, we want to reduce cancer mortality even further, and you could put some aggregated number on that. But what about setting up some clear priorities to say, look, we're going to the cancers that are not yet screenable, because we know early detection is key. We are going to set a goal for the US or the scientific enterprise to develop ways to effectively screen for cancers that right now we can't detect until it's too late and there's a high mortality. I'm making that up as a priority. But although I think it's not a bad one, what does the world look like if, as many other countries have done, we at the US say, here is our strategic set of goals for health for the US. And under that, what are our strategic goals for cancer? We should always continue to battle every cancer. There's no question about that. But what are the things what would success look like from our NIH and other system is one way that I think about it. And other countries have set up these kinds of strategic goals. I think that might work.
So one of the other things that's really frustrating, that's got to be part of the success, is not only speeding innovation, but speeding adoption. So, the New York Times had a story recently. It said that half of patients with advanced lung cancer don't get treatment. I just had a very disheartening conversation with a friend whose relative died from I think, a treatable cancer, but she didn't even go for, when she got the diagnosis, she just gave up and didn't go for treatment. How do we move that forward? Because I think that would, you're talking about a 30% increase in survival. I think if we had 100% adoption of everything that we know it can work now, that would drive that number much higher.
You are so right. ASCO has also worked on this just to look at what happens to cancer survivorship if all discovery ended today, but we just got everyone onto guideline concordant care, which for everybody out there who doesn't think about this every day, that means the care that for which there's the best evidence that is going to give someone a survivorship opportunity. The best possible clinical evidence right now is what guideline concordant care is. So we know that a significant fraction, if I remember the data correctly, is upwards of 20% of patients in the US are not offered guideline concordant care. And that's in line with what was discussed in that New York Times article. That's disheartening. And that's a health system fix that I think that we really need to work on. And I could probably do a whole podcast with you on just healthcare delivery and how we could enhance cancer survivorship just with that. I have a lot of views having lived the life there. But I want to take it even a step further. So if I get diagnosed with cancer, I certainly want to know what is the best guideline concordant care that could be offered to me. And I want to ask questions about that and what the alternatives are and what the quality of life implications are for me. As a patient, that's what I would want. But what I would also want is to understand what is the next advanced care coming. What is the cutting edge thing that's percolating through the system that I might be able to get access to? And what I'm speaking of course, is clinical trial. So the data in the US right now are not different than decades ago when I first started training in oncology, which is single digit of patients who have a cancer diagnosis and are enrolled on clinical trial. I think the number right now in the US is around 7%. This is totally unacceptable. And the data are quite clear on this, that most patients just aren't asked. And so that's something I think that we actually must fix. And this is where I think I know technology is poised to help. And I think of this as an AI for good type scenario of seeing this play out in real life of companies like Paradigm Health and others that are using technology to ensure that patients get access to clinical trials.
So I want to shift over once. So I'm in Washington, and I know you spend a lot of time thinking about Washington. I think you could say, well, since the Second World War, despite all the gaps we've talked about, the United States has gotten a lot of things right when it comes to scientific innovation. And I think that a lot of that is based on the kind of foundation in generous funding for basic research, an effective science-based regulatory system, an ability to attract and retain the brightest and best minds from around the world to come to the United States. All of those things are kind of under challenge right now. Just looking at regulatory, the commissioner of the FDA resigned or announced his resignation recently. FDA's oncology staff has been cut about in half in the last year as a result of firings and lack of morale and people leaving. How do you think about that? How important are those things to being able to make the things that we're talking about happen?
Yeah, no, this is something that we also have been thinking a lot about, because as we meet with not just our investigators that we funded our Parker Institutes, but also the CEOs of our portfolio companies, are feeling just this existential threat of, how do we function in an environment that's less stable than we are used to seeing? And certainly, I think it's true in every discipline that talent follows stability. So we are not signaling to the early career investigators in the United States, be they PhDs, MDs, or both, that the US is providing a place of predictable durable funding for potential game-changing science that could improve lives. We're not sending that signal. And so people are questioning, what their career path would be, but also whether or not that career would be in the US. That's of concern. Our clinical investigators are very concerned about being able to conduct clinical trials. So we talked about the access issue. Well, some things like indirect cost recovery that comes back to academic medical centers helps you pay for your clinical trials unit. So there's a potential for a real negative impact of patients in the US getting access to potential life-saving therapeutics because the clinical trial infrastructure is starting to erode. And then from the perspective of FDA, we've long standing in oncology been the first place that drugs have been approved globally that have become these blockbuster drugs that have helped reduce that cancer mortality by 34%. Will that continue to be true if there's not predictability and stability in the FDA? Are, I think, reasonable questions to ask. And so then what is the global mindset about where you're going to go for your first approval and where are you going to conduct your clinical trials? These are heady topics that I believe merit multidisciplinary discussion at the level of government of how are we going to ensure that our investment in science results in health and that people in the US continue to have early access to life-saving therapeutics, especially for cancer.
So a final question, I wrote a story. I hope everybody who listens to this finds a way to get access to a story that I wrote about the Parker Institute, and it's kind of remarkable that what you've been able to do. But the question I have is it replicable? Is the model for what you are doing in immunotherapy for cancer replicable? Not only for immunotherapy for cancer, but for other areas, because there's a lot of unmet need out there outside of cancer, obviously.
Yeah, well, even within cancer, I think, because we're in the cancer therapeutic space, right? But it's also been a cold winter for diagnostics. And again, like there's if you think about health as a business, as or running like a business, or the goal of running toward health like a business, the earlier that you catch a cancer, the better it is for the patient. They have a higher rate of surviving. The better it is for their employer, if they're still employed, because of an overall lower cost of care. And the better it is for the US economy because they get back into the workforce. So this is literally everyone wins when you detect cancer early. Yet it's been very challenging for diagnostic companies to get the capital that they need to get to clinical testing and do that proof point. It's also been very difficult to work with regulatory to get to the point of being able to design the trial that's going to get you where you want to go. So if I were going to wave a magic wand and say, let's replicate a Parker Institute type model, diagnostics might be one of them. I think it may take someone to be in this end to end to get it done. And this could have a really significant impact, globally. And the technologies are there, not just ctDNA, of course, that's starting to come both in tracking cancer, but also in detecting cancer, but other elements of liquid biopsy that are really primed for identifying someone who has a cancer early. So let's take an example. Lung cancer continues to be the #1 cause of cancer death for both men and women in the United States. We know that someone who's a heavy smoker has a high risk. And so those patients are actually eligible for low-dose CT screening for lung cancer. Too few of them do it, right? Which we need to understand and mitigate, but they're at least eligible. What about the rest? What about those that didn't smoke enough to meet the eligibility criteria? Or what about someone who realizes that they've been living with radon, which is, by the way, is the second leading cause of lung cancer in the US that too few people know? There's no screen for them. And all we can do is kind of monitor and watch. And so what does a world look like if someone for this massively impactful cancer in the US can be diagnosed early, where now we actually know we have effective treatments for lung cancer? So it's not that We'd be diagnosing a cancer for which we had no output. What does that world look like? Someone, I think, needs to get in the cancer space and really think through the diagnostic piece and how do you develop a Parker-like end-to-end. Could it work in other models? Absolutely. But it will take the wherewithal of somebody like Sean Parker, who said, I'm a disruptive thinker and I'm going to use first principles that get used in the tech world to solve for a problem, not by trying to edit and fix an existing system. I'm just going to create the one that should be. And I think if for big problems, there were more people who stepped into that space, I absolutely think it's replicable.
Well, great. Well, thanks. We could do this again. I hope we will do this again. It's a fascinating conversation, and thank you again for taking the time to speak with me.
You bet, Steve, and I'll see you at Grand Rounds.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that's what our plug was in the middle of it. So thanks a lot.
You bet.
Okay.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Regional Host Chair Allen Institute this June in Seattle for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury Show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.